A young autistic girl is publicly humiliated by a millionaire after accidentally bumping into his son at a gala. But when the businessman's son is diagnosed with a rare neurological condition, only one person can help him reconnect with the world, the very person he rejected. What happens next will forever change both of their destinies. Subscribe to the channel for heartwarming stories every day. Camera flashes bounced off the marble walls of the ballroom. The millionaire adjusted his silk tie as he smiled for another photo. His arm rested on his son's shoulders, the perfect heir to his financial empire. This was his natural habitat, the center of attention, surrounded by people who measured success in bank balances. "Sir, the Wall Street Journal would like a statement about the new acquisition," his assistant whispered, approaching discreetly. "Tell them I'll be available in 10 minutes. I want to enjoy my son's company a little longer," he replied with that deep voice that brooked no argument. The gala shimmered. Crystals sparkled under strategically placed lights to create an atmosphere of opulence. The controlled laughter, the clinking glasses, the calculated whispers, all part of a social symphony that he conducted with mastery. Miles away, in reality and in essence, the girl watched, fascinated by the colorful lights that decorated the entrance of the center. Her fingers moved in the air, as if trying to touch the luminous beams dancing before her eyes. For her, each color had an almost palpable texture, a unique vibration that few could perceive. "It's time to get ready," said the caregiver, gently touching her shoulder. The girl didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were still navigating the spectrum of colors. When she finally turned her face, she didn't make eye contact, but her slight smile indicated that she understood. The Center for Special Needs Children didn't have the luxury of marble or crystals. The walls were painted in soft colors, designed to calm the most sensitive spirits. The furniture was functional, resistant to the occasional emotional outbursts of its residents. Among colorful drawings pinned to the walls and educational toys scattered around, there was an aura of acceptance that contrasted with the world. Outside, "Today will be a different day," explained the director, kneeling to be at the same level as the girl. "We're going to a special event. There will be lots of pretty lights there, like the ones you're seeing now." The idea for the charity event had come about as an opportunity to promote the center's work. Businessmen and philanthropists would be present, people with the power to transform the lives of those children with a simple signature on a check. The director knew that bringing some of the children could sensitize potential donors, but she also recognized the risks of exposing them to such a stimulating environment. The girl swayed slightly back and forth, processing the information. Her hands touched the fabric of the new dress, a gift donated especially for the occasion. The texture was different, less comfortable than her usual clothes. "There will be noise," she said finally, not as a question but as a statement. "Yes, there will be some noise," the director confirmed, "but we'll be with you the whole time. If it gets too difficult, we can go outside and take a breather, like we do here." On the other side of the city, the millionaire checked his platinum watch. The charity gala was just another commitment in his busy schedule, an event where his presence would be recorded, commented on, valued. Another opportunity to assert his status. "Dad, do I really have to go?" asked his son, adjusting the suit jacket that fit perfectly over his young shoulders. "Of course," he replied firmly. "It's important for everyone to see you as my successor. Besides, these events are crucial for our public relations." The boy nodded, accustomed to suppressing any sign of resistance. He had learned early on that in his father's world, appearances mattered more than feelings. The emptiness in his chest was already an old companion, almost comfortable in its familiarity. The doors of the event hall opened for the center's group. The director at the front, followed by 3 carefully selected children, those who best handled crowds. Among them, the girl walked with hesitant steps, her eyes immediately captured by the spectacle of lights decorating the ceiling. "Remember what we agreed," whispered the caregiver beside her. "If it gets too difficult, let me know." But the girl was already in another world. The lights formed hypnotic patterns that absorbed her completely. Her hands moved in the air, following the invisible rhythm that only she could perceive. To the inattentive observers, it might seem like strange behavior. For her, it was a dance with the sensory universe that surrounded her. On the other side of the hall, the millionaire was talking with potential investors. His son remained by his side, his expression politely interested, masking deep boredom. The boy watched the activity around him when he noticed the girl with her hands dancing in the air. "Who's that?" he asked, leaning towards his father. The millionaire followed his son's gaze and frowned slightly. "Must be one of the children from the beneficiary center today. Keep your distance, son. These charity events are important for our image, but we don't need to get directly involved." But there was something in the hypnotic movement of the girl's hands that captured the boy's attention. While his father was distracted by another guest, he subtly moved away, moving towards the unusual visitor. The director of the center circulated through the hall, engaging in strategic conversations with potential donors. She noticed the millionaire's son approaching the girl and felt a pang in her chest. She knew the businessman's ruthless reputation well and feared any interaction that could get out of control. The girl continued absorbed in the lights, oblivious to the boy's approach. Her eyes reflected the glow of the decorations, as if each spark contained an entire universe to be explored. When the boy stopped a few steps away from her, she didn't show that she noticed his presence. "What are you looking at?" he asked, genuinely curious. Without taking her eyes off the lights, she replied, "The colors dance. They make music without sound." The boy looked up, trying to see what she saw. To him, they were just decorative lights, pretty but common. There was something in the intensity of her gaze that intrigued him. "I can't hear the music," he commented, tilting his head. "You don't listen to it. You feel it," she replied, finally lowering her gaze and, for a brief moment, almost meeting his eyes before looking away again. In that instant, something indescribable happened, as if a window had been briefly opened between two distinct worlds. The boy felt a shiver run down his spine, a strange sense of recognition, as if this peculiar girl understood something fundamental that he himself had forgotten. Across the room, the millionaire noticed his son's absence. When he located him talking to the strange girl, his face hardened. With purposeful strides, he crossed the room toward them. "Son, the Andersons are requesting your presence," he said firmly, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. His cold eyes briefly scanned the girl, noting her peculiar gestures and the way she avoided eye contact. The look of displeasure on his face was subtle, but undeniable. The boy hesitated. "Dad, this girl can see music in the lights." The millionaire forced an artificial smile. "Fascinating. Now come on, we shouldn't keep the Andersons waiting." The girl, sensing the growing tension, took a step back. Her hands began to flutter more intensely, a sign of anxiety that her caregiver immediately recognized. "Are you all right?" asked the caregiver, approaching quickly. But before she could answer, a waiter passed by with a tray of crystal glasses. The girl, stepping back further, without realizing the movement behind her, collided with the waiter. The shrill sound of crystal shattering against the marble floor cut through the background music like a razor. The entire ballroom froze. All eyes converged on the small disaster. And in the center of it all, the girl, now visibly distressed by the sudden noise and the unwanted attention, covered her ears and began to rock back and forth. "What is this?" The millionaire's voice cut through the silence that followed the commotion. His eyes, previously only cold, now burned with indignation. "Who brought this?" He hesitated, measuring his words before the public, but not enough to mask his disdain. This child to an event of this magnitude? The director of the center hurried toward the scene, her heart racing with a mixture of concern for the girl and apprehension about the guests' reaction. "I sincerely apologize for the disruption," she began, positioning herself protectively beside the child who was still covering her ears, increasingly withdrawn into her private world. "Apologies?" The millionaire let out a dry laugh, calculatedly, restrained but loaded with venom. "This is a gala, not a science fair. This child is clearly not equipped to be here." Some murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The millionaire's son remained still, torn between embarrassment and an inexplicable desire to defend that stranger who moments before had shown him an invisible world. "Sir, with all due respect," the director kept her voice steady. "Despite the internal tremor, our children have as much right to be here as anyone. This event is precisely to support the inclusion we advocate for." The millionaire's face hardened. The camera flashes continued, now capturing a completely different moment than he had planned. His carefully constructed reputation was at risk in the face of a situation that was spiraling out of his control. "Right?" He lowered his tone, approaching the director, the words now only for the closest ears. "Look around you. This is an environment of refinement of business. Take your freaks to appropriate events." The word landed like a stone. The caregiver who had approached to comfort the girl gasped, shocked. The millionaire's son took an instinctive step back, as if physically struck by his father's cruelty. The girl, despite her covered ears, seemed to pick up the vibration of that word in the air. Her hands lowered slowly, and for the first time, her eyes met the millionaire's directly. There was no anger in them, just a deep and disconcerting understanding, as if she could see beyond the man's social mask. "The lights have stopped singing," she said in a monotonous but clear voice. The millionaire stepped back, inexplicably disturbed by that direct gaze. Something in those eyes awakened a distant echo, a memory that he had buried so deeply that he no longer even recognized it as his own. "Get her out of here," he ordered, quickly regaining his composure, "or I'll cancel my contribution to this cause." The threat hung in the air like toxic fumes. The director of the center paled. That donation represented an entire year of therapies, treatments, and facility improvements. Her voice failed when she tried to argue again. "Dad?" The millionaire's son finally interjected, his voice low but audible in the tense silence. "She didn't mean to do it." The look he received from his father was glacial. "Don't get involved. This is an adult matter." The event staff were already moving discreetly, cleaning up the shards of glass. The background music returned, in an obvious attempt to normalize the situation. The guests, after the initial shock, returned to their conversations, although the incident was certainly the new central topic. The caregiver gently wrapped her arms around the girl's shoulders. "Come on, honey, let's get some air." The director of the center, swallowing her pride, bowed slightly to the millionaire. "I apologize for the disruption. We'll be withdrawing." The millionaire nodded coldly, satisfied with the resolution, and turned to the nearby guests with a rehearsed smile. "Well, the night is young. Where were we?" As the small group headed for the exit, the millionaire's son watched the girl walk away. She turned one last time, not to look directly at him, but at the lights above. Her lips moved in silent words, as if saying goodbye to invisible friends. Outside, under the starry sky, the girl finally relaxed her tense shoulders. A solitary tear ran down her face, not because of what the millionaire had said. Cruel words were nothing new in her life, but because of the abrupt interruption of the dance of lights that had so enchanted her. "He has darkness inside," she said to the director who was guiding her to the car. Not the good darkness, like the night, the darkness that hurts. The director squeezed her hand gently, surprised as always by the sharp perception that hid behind the girl's seemingly disconnected behavior. "Some people don't know how to see beauty that's different," she replied simply. What none of them could foresee is that soon, that darkness mentioned by the girl would overflow, completely transforming the lives of the millionaire and his son. 3 weeks after the incident at the gala, the millionaire occupied his usual seat at the head of the long dining table. The mansion, with its high ceilings and impeccable decor, reflected exactly the image he had built for himself over the years. Imposing, cold, perfect in every controlled detail. "Sir, you've barely touched your food," observed the housekeeper, after removing the almost untouched plates. "I have no appetite," he replied dryly, his eyes fixed on the empty chair across the table. "Hasn't my son come down yet?" The housekeeper hesitated, which did not go unnoticed by the millionaire. "Sir, the young man asked to be served in his room again. He said he was unwell." A wrinkle of concern crossed the businessman's forehead. In recent days, his son's behavior had changed drastically. The always quiet and obedient boy had now become practically reclusive, avoiding family meals and refusing to accompany his father on social engagements. "This can't continue," he declared, getting up abruptly. "I'm going to talk to him." He climbed the steps of the main staircase with purposeful strides. He wasn't used to being disobeyed, much less ignored. The door to his son's room remained closed, as it had been in recent days. He knocked firmly, but without waiting for a response, he turned the doorknob. The room was dim, with heavy curtains blocking the evening light. The son was sitting on the floor, back against the bed, staring blankly at the opposite wall. He didn't move with his father's entrance. "This is absurd," began the millionaire, flipping the light switch. The sudden light made the boy cover his eyes with a groan of discomfort. "You can't keep hiding in here as if you have some kind of problem." The son didn't respond. His eyes, when they finally adjusted to the light, seemed distant, as if focused on something that his father couldn't see. "I'm talking to you," insisted the millionaire, approaching. "What's going on? Is it because of that ridiculous scene at the gala? It's over. No one even remembers it anymore." The son's silence disturbed him more than any response could. For the first time, he noticed the drawings scattered on the floor. Abstract shapes, spirals, repetitive patterns in vibrant colors. "What's this? You've never been interested in art," he commented, picking up one of the drawings. A pattern resembling the lights from that fateful night occupied the entire sheet. Upon touching the paper, something unexpected happened. The boy reacted with a swift movement, snatching the drawing from his father's hand with an intensity never seen before. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice strangely monotonous. "The colors have to stay together." The millionaire recoiled, shocked not only by the gesture, but by the transformation he saw before his eyes. Where was the obedient and socially adjusted son he had raised? This stranger in front of him seemed almost... An icy thought crossed his mind. No, it was impossible. Coincidence, nothing more. "Tomorrow you're going back to school," he declared, forcing firmness into his voice. "And next week we have the board meeting. Your presence is mandatory." In response, the son simply returned to sit on the floor, resuming the drawing that had been interrupted. His strokes were methodical, repetitive, as if following an internal logic that only he understood. Disconcerted, the millionaire left the room. In the hallway, he found the housekeeper waiting anxiously. "Sir," she began cautiously, "I think we should call a doctor. The young man isn't eating right. He barely sleeps." "He's just being rebellious," he interrupted, more to himself than to her. "It's a phase." But the next morning, the situation worsened drastically. The millionaire was awakened by the housekeeper in a panic. His son wasn't responding. He was curled up in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, his glazed eyes fixed on nothing. The businessman's world crumbled at that moment. The ambulance, the hospital, the endless tests. Words like catatonic episode, behavioral regression, atypical neurological condition echoed through the sterile hallways. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact diagnosis without more tests, explained the neurologist after the initial battery of exams. But there are clear indicators of a rare neurological condition that may have been triggered by extreme stress or trauma. Trauma, repeated the millionaire, incredulous. My son has always had the best of everything. What trauma could he have suffered? The doctor adjusted his glasses, carefully choosing his words. Trauma isn't always obvious or physical, sir. Sometimes it's constant pressure, unrealistic expectations, the absence of genuine emotional connections. The millionaire felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He turned away from the conversation, approaching the window of the doctor's office. Outside, the world continued, people coming and going, oblivious to the fact that his particular universe had just imploded. "What's the treatment?" he asked finally, without turning around. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any answer. "Sir," the doctor finally spoke, "there is no conventional treatment for this specific condition. We can try medications to stabilize some symptoms, behavioral therapies, but what?" He turned around sharply, the despair showing for the first time in his always controlled eyes. "But each case is unique. The results are unpredictable. Your son seems to have retreated into an inner world for reasons that we may never fully understand." The millionaire left the hospital that night, carrying not only his silent son, but the crushing weight of a reality for which none of his achievements or riches had prepared him. A world where his power meant nothing, where his money couldn't buy solutions. At home, he settled his son into his room with private nurses and the best specialists that money could hire. But at night, when everyone withdrew, he sat beside the boy's bed in silence. The boy, now almost always mute, continued, drawing his abstract patterns, as if trying to communicate something that words could not express. It was on one of those lonely nights that the millionaire allowed himself to remember, not just the incident at the gala, but a girl with eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. A girl that his son, for a few precious moments, seemed to understand better than he ever had. The black limousine parked discreetly in front of the modest building of the center. The driver, accustomed to waiting for his boss at luxury hotels and corporate meeting rooms, seemed out of place in that simple environment, with its colorful walls and the garden filled with adapted toys. The millionaire adjusted his tie out of habit, an automatic gesture that masked his nervousness. For the past 2 weeks, he had consulted the best specialists in the country, flying in his private jet to renowned clinics. All offered variations of the same disheartening prognosis. His son had developed a rare neurological condition, possibly triggered by chronic stress, that was isolating him in an increasingly inaccessible inner world. "Sir?" The receptionist at the center stared at him curiously, clearly recognizing his face from the news, but uncertain about the reason for his presence. "I need to speak with the director," he declared, his voice lower than usual. "It's a personal matter." The wait in the small anteroom was a disconcerting experience. Accustomed to environments where his presence commanded immediate attention, he now found himself sitting in a simple chair, observing the comings and goings of children and caregivers. Some children looked at him with direct curiosity. Others seemed completely oblivious to his presence, absorbed in their own private worlds. One of them, a boy of approximately 7 years old, stopped in front of him and examined him with uncomfortable intensity. "Your sadness smells like metal," he declared, before continuing his way down the hall. The millionaire was paralyzed, the boy's words echoing in his mind like a distant bell. Before he could process the strange encounter, the door to the director's office opened. "Well, this is unexpected," she said, not hiding her surprise and a slight hostility in her voice. "Please, come in." The office was simple, functional, with walls covered in colorful drawings and certificates of specialization. The director made no effort to disguise the tension that hung in the air. Their last encounter was still vivid in both their memories. "To what do I owe this visit?" she asked directly, after indicating a chair for him. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his social interactions, suddenly felt vulnerable. The words rehearsed on the way seemed inadequate, empty. "My son," he began, his voice faltering slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "My son is ill." The director's expression softened imperceptibly. Despite her resentment at the way her children had been treated at the event, years of working with families in crisis had cultivated in her a genuine compassion. "I'm sorry to hear that," she replied, warmer now. "What is the nature of the illness?" The millionaire spent the next few minutes explaining the symptoms, the inconclusive diagnoses, the behavioral regression that had transformed his lively son into a silent and isolated child. "The doctors call it an atypical neurological condition with spectrum features," he concluded, the medical words sounding foreign in his mouth. "They say there is no effective conventional treatment." The director watched him attentively, connecting the invisible dots of a story that was beginning to make sense. "Why did you come to me?" she asked finally, although she already suspected the answer. The millionaire took a deep breath, facing the moment he had dreaded so much, the explicit recognition of his powerlessness, the admission of needing help precisely from those he had scorned. "The girl," he said simply, "the one from the event, my son, he was different when he spoke with her, connected in some way that I can't explain." A heavy silence hung between them. The director carefully considered her next words, aware of the impact they would have. "I understand that you are desperate for your son's health," she began cautiously, "but our children are not therapeutic instruments to be used when convenient, especially after they have been humiliated." The words struck the millionaire like a whip. The memory of his own cruel words that night haunted him now, amplified by his son's silent suffering. "I know," he admitted, with a humility that surprised even himself. "I have no right to ask this, but I'm not asking for myself." The vulnerability in his voice was so genuine that the director felt her resistance waver. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between manipulation and true despair. "I'll talk to her," she decided finally. "But the decision will be hers, completely hers. Our children have a voice here, sir. It's one of the fundamental principles of our center." The relief on the millionaire's face was palpable. "Thank you. Anything you need, better facilities, equipment, specialists." The director raised her hand, interrupting him. "I'm not negotiating a business deal. I'm considering the well-being of both children." That same afternoon, the director found the girl in her favorite area, the sensory garden, where different textures and aromas created a sanctuary of pleasant stimuli. With patience, she explained the situation carefully, without influencing her decision. To her surprise, the girl showed no resentment or hesitation. "He needs someone who understands the music without sound," she said simply, her fingers stroking the lavender leaves in the garden. "I can help." The director watched her with silent admiration. The ability to forgive and the sharp intuition hidden behind behaviors that many considered limiting never ceased to amaze her. "Are you sure about this? That man was very cruel to you," she reminded her gently. The girl finally looked up, almost meeting the director's eyes before looking away again. "He was scared," she replied, with a disconcerting simplicity. "Fear makes A loud noise inside people. I know what it's like when the noise gets too loud. The next day, the millionaire's limousine waited at the entrance of the mansion. The man paced back and forth in the main hall, repeatedly checking if everything was perfect. He had dismissed most of the staff to ensure a peaceful environment, following the director's precise instructions. When the doorbell finally rang, he had to restrain the impulse to run to the door. Upon opening it, he found the director and, partially hidden behind her, the girl. She wore large headphones and held a drawing pad firmly against her chest. "Welcome," said the millionaire, his voice devoid of its habitual arrogance. "Please, come in." The girl took small, hesitant steps into the mansion, her eyes immediately captured by the large crystal chandelier on the ceiling of the hall. Without saying a word, she took a pencil from her pocket and began to sketch in the pad, totally absorbed in reproducing the glittering shapes. "Where is your son?" asked the director, carefully observing the girl's reaction to the new environment. "In his room. He rarely leaves it now." The pain in his voice was evident, too raw to be disguised. The girl stopped her drawing and looked at the millionaire, not directly in the eyes, but enough for him to feel the impact of her attention. "I can see him now," she declared, not as a request, but as a simple statement. As they climbed the main staircase, the millionaire tried to explain his son's current condition. The girl showed no reaction to the clinical explanations, as if the medical terms had no relevance to what she was about to encounter. At the bedroom door, the private nurse looked surprised by the unexpected visitor. The millionaire gestured for him to step aside, allowing the girl to enter first. The room was dim, with only a small, indirect light illuminating the space. The millionaire's son was sitting on the floor, surrounded by dozens of drawings of obsessively repetitive geometric patterns. The girl stopped at the entrance, observing the scene intently. Without any hesitation or indication from the director, she walked to where the boy was and sat silently beside him, maintaining a comfortable distance. For several minutes, she said nothing. She simply opened her own pad and began to draw, fluid strokes that seemed to dance on the paper. The millionaire and the director watched from the door, holding their breath. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boy began to look at her drawing. His eyes, previously fixed on nothing, now showed a faint glimmer of interest. The girl, without interrupting her work or looking directly at him, said softly, "The colors sing louder when they dance together." It was just a sentence, 5 simple words. But for the millionaire, watching the scene with a heavy heart, it was as if a ray of light had penetrated the darkness that had enveloped his son for weeks. The boy didn't respond verbally, but his hands, which had previously created rigid and repetitive patterns, began to move differently on the paper. Next to the last geometric drawing, he started something new, a shape that vaguely resembled the glow of the chandelier that the girl had observed moments before. In the weeks that followed, a strange but effective routine was established. 3 times a week, the girl visited the mansion, always accompanied by the director. The sessions, as the millionaire secretly called them, lasted exactly 2 hours, not a minute more or less. The precision was important to the girl, the director explained, and therefore essential for progress. The first signs of improvement were subtle. The millionaire's son began to react to the visitor's presence, not with words, but with small gestures of recognition. A pencil offered when she was looking for a specific color. A drawing placed next to hers as a silent response to her work. "It's incredible," commented the neurologist during a follow-up appointment. "There's a remarkably more intense brain activity in the areas of social communication. What exactly does this girl do during the visits?" The millionaire tried to explain, but the words seemed inadequate to describe what he witnessed. It wasn't conventional therapy. There were no clearly defined goals, structured exercises, or progress evaluations. It was something more organic, like a silent dance between two minds that in some mysterious way managed to communicate on a frequency inaccessible to others. She doesn't try to force him to change, he explained as best he could. She simply exists beside him in his world. And somehow that's building a bridge. In the fourth week, the first sound. During the session, while drawing side by side, the girl began to hum softly, a simple, repetitive, almost hypnotic melody. The boy, after a few minutes, emitted a similar sound, not exactly the same note, but complementary, as if responding to her melody with a harmony of his own. The millionaire, who was watching discreetly through the ajar door, felt involuntary tears run down his usually impassive face. It was the first voluntary sound he had heard from his son in almost 2 months. "He's singing with the colors," the girl explained later, when the director asked about the moment. In the 6th week, the first word, the girl had brought a small box with different textures, fabrics, papers, small tactile objects. While exploring the contents with the boy, she held out a piece of blue velvet. "Soft," she said, rubbing the fabric against her own face before offering it to him. The boy touched the fabric, felt its texture. After a long moment, his lips moved. "Soft," he repeated, his voice hoarse from prolonged disuse. The news of the first word spread quickly through the mansion. The millionaire, who was in an important video conference, interrupted the meeting without explanations and ran to his son's room. When he arrived, he found the director with tears in her eyes and the girl calmly continuing the exploration of the materials, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. That night, after the visitors left, the millionaire sat on the edge of his son's bed. The boy didn't speak again, but there was something different in his eyes, a presence that had been absent for too long. "She's helping you, isn't she?" he asked softly, without really expecting an answer. To his surprise, the son nodded slightly, a deliberate gesture of communication. The millionaire ran his hand through his son's hair, a gesture of affection that had become rare in recent years, replaced by distant approvals of academic and social performances. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words carrying the weight of years of a relationship based on expectations instead of acceptance. The 8th week brought a progress that no specialist had predicted. During the session, the boy not only spoke some isolated words, but formed a complete sentence. "I want to show you something." He got up with movements still a little stiff and walked to a drawer. From there, he took out an object carefully wrapped in fabric. Upon unwrapping it, he revealed a small glass sculpture, a bird with open wings that the millionaire immediately recognized. It was a piece of art that had belonged to his deceased sister. The girl watched the shimmering object with obvious fascination. The boy held it against the light, creating colorful reflections that danced across the walls of the room. "It was my aunt's," he said, his voice firmer now. "Dad kept it when she died." The millionaire, who was watching from the door as usual, felt the blood freeze in his veins. He had never told his son about his sister. The object had been stored in a locked box in his private office for more than 2 decades, since the day of the funeral. "How did you?" he began to ask, entering the room. The boy turned to him, and for the first time in weeks, their gazes truly met. "I found it when I was looking for your old photo album." There was a picture of her holding the glass bird. The revelation triggered a wave of conflicting emotions in the millionaire. On one hand, the joy of seeing his son communicating again. On the other, the shock of having his carefully buried past suddenly exposed. "Who was she?" asked the boy, with a direct curiosity that the millionaire hadn't heard in years. The question hung in the air like a sentence. The director, sensing the sudden tension, made a subtle movement to get up, but the millionaire raised his hand, asking her to stay. "She was my younger sister," he replied, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "Her name was Clara." Was she like me? The girl spoke for the first time since the beginning of that interaction, her voice soft but unmistakably clear. She wasn't looking directly at the millionaire, but her fingers were delicately touching the glass bird that the boy now held between them. The question hit the millionaire like a physical blow. Decades of denial, of escape, of meticulous construction of a facade of perfection crumbled before that simple question. Yes, he finally admitted, the word carrying the weight of a long-delayed confession. She was autistic, diagnosed at 6, at a time when nobody really understood, when our family didn't know how to. His voice failed. The son and the girl waited patiently, without pressure for him to continue, without judgment for his hesitation. That moment of shared vulnerability seemed to suspend the usual hierarchies between them. She died at 16, the millionaire finally continued. A household accident. She was home alone. I was supposed to be looking after her. The silence that followed wasn't empty, but dense with understanding. The director watched the scene with silent tears, witnessing a healing that went far beyond the boy's communicative progress. "That's why you were scared of me in the Hall of Lights," said the girl, with that disconcerting clarity that often emerged amidst her seemingly disconnected behaviors. "I reminded you of her." The millionaire couldn't answer. Decades of repressed guilt, of denial of the past, of frenetic construction of a life based on absolute control, all to avoid confronting his own failure to protect his sister, now exploded in silent tears that he couldn't contain. The son, witnessing his father's vulnerability for the first time, approached hesitantly, and, in a gesture that seemed both strange and deeply natural, placed his hand on his shoulder. "The bird still flies," he said, pointing to the glass sculpture, "even inside the closed box." The profound simplicity of that observation, coming from a boy who weeks before was lost in his own inaccessible world, struck the millionaire to the core. In that moment, he understood that the true prison wasn't his son's neurological condition, but his own inability to accept difference. A pattern that had begun with the unconscious rejection of his own sister and culminated in the public humiliation of an innocent child. The girl, seeming to sense the intensity of the moment, reached out and lightly touched the millionaire's arm, a gesture of comfort that, coming from her, carried extraordinary meaning. "Sometimes," she said, "people break because the world is too loud, not because they're fragile." 2 weeks after the revelation about Clara, the world that the millionaire was carefully rebuilding began to crumble due to external forces. The news of his regular visits to the center and the frequent presence of the girl in his mansion didn't go unnoticed for long. "Sir, there's a situation that needs your immediate attention," announced his personal assistant, interrupting breakfast. For the first time in months, the millionaire and his son were sharing the meal in the dining room, a small but significant step towards normality. The newspaper was placed before him with evident hesitation. In the business section, a headline, in bold, "Philanthropy or Opportunism. Tycoon seeks redemption after scandal with special needs child." The millionaire's blood ran cold as he read the article. The incident at the gala, which he believed forgotten, was detailed, including quotes from his disastrous interaction with the girl. Worse, his recent visits to the center were characterized as a cynical attempt to clean up his public image after the video of the incident had leaked on social media. "How many have seen this?" he asked, his controlled voice masking growing panic. "It's the top business story this morning, sir. And there's more." The assistant handed him a tablet with emails from 3 important members of his company's board. All expressed concern about his recent instability and questionable decisions. An extraordinary board meeting had been called for the following week. The son, who was watching the scene silently, asked with his new, still hesitant voice. "This is about her, isn't it?" The millionaire nodded, unable to hide the truth. "Yes. Some people don't understand what she's been doing for us. Can't we see her anymore?" The worry in the boy's voice was palpable. Before he could answer, the phone rang. It was the director of the center, her voice tense and concerned. "We need to talk urgently. We're facing complications." An hour later, the director was in his private office in the mansion. Her face showed exhaustion and worry. "We've received subpoenas from Child Protective Services," she explained without preamble. "Someone filed a formal complaint questioning the appropriateness of allowing our resident to regularly visit your residence. They're implying exploitation of a vulnerable minor." "This is absurd," exploded the millionaire, his indignation genuine. "She's helping my son. She's creating a connection that no therapist has been able to." "I know that," replied the director firmly, "but I also know how this can look to outsiders. A powerful man who publicly humiliated an autistic child now uses her for his own interests." "That's not how it is." "I'm not saying it is," she interrupted. "I'm saying how the situation is being framed. And as director of a respected center, I have legal responsibilities that I can't ignore." The millionaire felt the weight of his own past actions returning like an avalanche. His public arrogance, cultivated for years as part of his business persona, now made it impossible for his sincere intentions to be believed. "What does this mean concretely?" he asked, fearing the answer. The director took a deep breath before answering. "It means that until the investigation is concluded, we can't allow her to continue visiting your residence. And your visits to the center need to be suspended." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. "For how long?" The son's voice came from the office door, where he was standing without either of the adults having noticed his presence. The director turned to him with genuine compassion. "We don't know, honey. Legal proceedings involving minors are complex and often lengthy." "But she's my friend," protested the boy, his voice choked with emotion, an intensity of feeling that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. "She understands the colors and sounds like nobody else." The millionaire watched his son, his heart aching at the progress that was now threatened. He turned to the director with renewed determination. "There must be a solution. I can hire the best lawyers, clear everything up quickly." "It's not that simple," she replied, shaking her head. "The more you use your power and influence, the more it will seem like you're trying to manipulate the system. That's exactly the kind of behavior they're expecting." That afternoon, the temporary farewell was devastating in its simplicity. The girl, informed gently about the situation, showed a surprising understanding. "It's because people don't understand the silent music," she said to the boy, while organizing the materials they had shared in recent weeks. "They only hear the noise." The millionaire's son, facing his first major loss since he had begun to reconnect with the world, was visibly struggling against tears. "Will we draw together again?" he asked, the uncertainty evident in his voice. The girl didn't offer empty guarantees. Instead, she handed him a small notebook with blank pages. "When I can't talk to someone," she explained, "I draw for them in my notebook. Even if they're far away, they can still see the drawing at some point." Her eyes briefly met the boy's, a rare and significant contact. "The colors don't disappear just because they're separated." As the director and the girl left, the millionaire remained at the door, watching the car drive away, his son beside him, holding the blank notebook like a precious treasure. Inside the mansion, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, bored. Members, public relations advisors, all demanded statements, explanations, strategies to control the damage. "Sir," insisted his press secretary, "we need to issue a statement immediately. We're suggesting a strategic distancing from the center." and the girl only temporarily. We can frame it as a misunderstanding. No, interrupted the millionaire, his voice calm but inflexible. There will be no distancing. There will be no denial. The press secretary looked confused. But sir, your reputation, the company's stock. For the first time in my life, replied the millionaire, watching his son, who was now drawing intensely in the notebook he had received. There are things more important than my reputation or the stock price. That night, alone in his office, the millionaire opened for the first time in decades the box of memories of his sister. Yellowed photographs, handmade cards, small objects that she collected obsessively. Traces of a life that he had allowed to be forgotten, not only by the world, but by himself. Among the items, he found a small diary. In the pages written with Clara's irregular handwriting, he discovered a rich and complex inner world that he had never known. Sharp observations about the family, deep reflections on nature, detailed drawings of patterns that only she saw. In the last entry, written on the eve of her death, she had noted, "My brother is becoming increasingly distant. I think I've become a burden to him. He can't see that I understand more than I show. Maybe one day he'll find someone who teaches him to see beyond appearances." The words, written by a teenager more than 20 years before, struck him like a prophecy. The millionaire spent the entire night reading and rereading his sister's words, while outside the media storm grew and the board meeting approached inexorably. The next morning, his son quietly entered the office, finding him asleep over the open diary. Without waking him, he placed beside him a newly drawn picture, an impressionistic portrait of the millionaire, the autistic girl, and himself, all connected by colored lines that flowed between them, forming a complex and beautiful pattern. In the lower corner of the drawing, he had written in careful letters, "Some connections are too strong to be broken by words in newspapers." The company auditorium was packed. Executives in suits, influential shareholders and board members occupied the front rows, their expressions varying between concern and poorly disguised disapproval. In the back rows, the press waited anxiously, cameras and recorders prepared to capture what promised to be the downfall of one of the country's most powerful businessmen. The murmuring ceased when the millionaire took the stage. Contrary to expectations, he wasn't wearing his usual impeccable suit, but a simple shirt and dress pants. There were no elaborate corporate slides, nor a team of advisors flanking him strategically. "I appreciate everyone's presence," he began, his voice calm but firm in the microphones. "This extraordinary meeting was called to discuss my leadership and the recent controversies involving my personal life. I'd like to address that directly." A tense silence dominated the room. The journalists leaned forward, anticipating the beginning of a meticulous public relations exercise or a strategy of denial. "For years, I built this company based on values such as excellence, control, and apparent perfection," he continued. "Today, I recognize that this stubborn pursuit of what I considered perfection has had a significant human cost for my employees, for my family, and recently, for an innocent child whom I had the arrogance to judge as inferior." Surprised, murmurs rippled through the auditorium. His press secretary, in the front row, paled visibly. "I'm not here to defend my actions or to solicit understanding. I'm here to take full responsibility for the man I've become. A man who, in his quest for control, lost touch with fundamental human values such as empathy and acceptance." The millionaire paused, taking a sip of water. His eyes swept across the audience, holding the gaze of each member of the board. "You've seen the videos, read the articles. Yes, I publicly humiliated an autistic child during a charity event. I called her a freak and demanded her removal. It was an unforgivable act that reveals not her failing, but the moral void into which I had allowed myself to fall. The public confession, devoid of any attempt at justification, left the audience stunned. Journalists typed frantically, capturing every word of this unprecedented admission. What you don't know, what I've kept hidden for decades, is the reason behind this repulsive behavior. His voice trembled slightly for the first time. When I was 20 years old, I lost my younger sister Clara. She was autistic. On the night she died, I was supposed to be looking after her, but I chose to go out with friends. A household accident that could have been avoided cost her life. The auditorium remained in absolute silence, the intimate confession creating an almost sacred atmosphere. Instead of confronting my guilt, I buried it. I built a fortress of success and power, convincing myself that absolute control over everything and everyone around me would prevent further loss. In the process, I became the kind of man who rejects and humiliates exactly the people who most deserve understanding. He took a deep breath, preparing for what was to come. Recently, my son was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition. The best specialists that money can hire proved unable to help him. It was then that the same girl I humiliated publicly re-entered our lives. Images began to be projected on the screen behind him, drawings made by his son during the sessions with the girl, showing a clear progression from obsessively repetitive patterns to increasingly communicative and emotionally connected expressions. This 12-year-old child, whom I had the arrogance to belittle, demonstrated more wisdom, forgiveness, and therapeutic skill than all the specialists combined. Without complex techniques or elaborate terminologies, she reached my son in his inner world and gently created a bridge back. The millionaire paused again, allowing the images to speak for themselves. Now, because of sensationalist headlines and malicious insinuations, this vital connection has been severed. An investigation has been opened questioning the appropriateness of this interaction, as if the only possible explanation for my interest was some kind of cynical public relations manipulation. The indignation in his voice was genuine, without any trace of the arrogance that had characterized him for so long. I fully understand the board's concerns about my leadership and the impact of these controversies on the company's stock. Therefore, I will not wait for a formal decision. Effective immediately, I am temporarily stepping down from the position of CEO. Exclamations of surprise echoed through the auditorium. This was the last thing anyone expected. This isn't a strategic public relations move. It's a personal necessity. For the first time in decades, I need to prioritize something beyond profits and corporate image. The recovery of my son and the rebuilding of the human values I sacrificed on the altar of success. While rumors swept through the audience, the millionaire raised his hand, asking for silence for his final words. To the members of the board, if after my leave, you decide that the company needs new permanent leadership, I will accept that decision without challenge. To the shareholders, I apologize for the disruptions caused by my personal actions. To the journalists present, I ask only that you consider that behind every sensationalist headline, there are real people whose lives and recovery can be deeply affected. With a last look at the astonished audience, he concluded, and to the girl, whose dignity I publicly injured and whose wisdom showed me a path of redemption that I didn't deserve, I promise that I will do everything in my power to protect her, even if it means abdicating everything I've built. As he stepped down from the stage, he was greeted not by the usual advisors and executives, but by his son, who had watched the speech from the side of the auditorium. The boy, still with hesitant movements but a determined expression, reached out to his father in a gesture of solidarity that no image consultant could have scripted. The press exploded in questions and flashes, but father and son left hand in hand, ignoring the media chaos they left behind. "You told everyone about Aunt Clara," commented the boy as they got into the car. "Yes," replied the millionaire, the emotional exhaustion evident in his voice. "I should have talked about her a long time ago." "What happens now?" asked the son, a question he would never have formulated in his old passive and obedient existence. The millionaire looked out the car window, watching the imposing building of his corporation recede. The empire he had built as a fortress against his own emotions now seemed strangely insignificant compared to what was really at stake. "Now," he replied with a quiet determination, "we find a way to fix what I broke." The next day, while the press dissected every word of his speech and analysts debated the impact on the company's stock, the millionaire contacted the most respected law firm in child rights, not for his own defense, but with a completely different objective. "I want to understand precisely how to create a legally shielded foundation," he explained to the specialized attorney who received him. "An organization that promotes research, treatment, and social inclusion for neurodivergent children, without it ever being interpreted as a public relations maneuver or controlled by corporate interests, including my own." The attorney, initially skeptical about his intentions, was gradually convinced by the sincerity and the surprisingly detailed knowledge he demonstrated about the specific needs of these children. "You seem to have done considerable research on the subject," she commented, after hours of discussion about organizational structures and legal safeguards. "No," he replied honestly. "I just started listening to those who really understand the subject." During the following weeks, while the foundation took shape in the legal and structural aspects, the millionaire faced another equally complex challenge: reconnecting his son with the girl who had helped him within the limits imposed by the ongoing investigation. The solution came from an unexpected source: his own son. During breakfast, after weeks of obsessively drawing in the notebook that the girl had given him, he slid a sheet of paper across the table. "I want to send this to her," he said simply. The drawing showed two children, separated by a kind of barrier, but connected by colored lines that crossed the obstacle as if it didn't exist. In the corner of the page, he had written carefully, "The colors still sing even when we can't see each other." "That's a beautiful thought," replied the millionaire, genuinely touched by the depth of the concept. "But we can't send it directly, due to the temporary restraining order." The son considered the problem for a moment, his mind working in ways that would have been impossible only a few months ago. "What if other people could see it too?" he suggested finally. "Not just her, but everyone." The idea, in its childlike simplicity, was brilliant. If the connection between the children couldn't continue privately due to suspicions of manipulation, perhaps it could happen in plain sight as part of a larger project. The town hall auditorium was packed, a far cry from the corporate room where the millionaire had made his stepping down speech weeks before. Here, there were no executives in suits or journalists eager for scandal. The audience was diverse, families with children of all ages and abilities, educators, therapists, curious people drawn by the controversial figure who was now in the spotlight for completely different reasons. "Welcome to the city's first neurodiverse art exhibit," announced the Master of Ceremonies, a respected university professor specializing in art therapy. This event also marks the official launch of the Clara Foundation, dedicated to promoting understanding, research, and inclusion for neurodivergent individuals. On panels scattered throughout the hall, dozens of artworks created by neurodivergent children and adults were displayed with professional lighting and detailed presentations. Not as curiosities or therapeutic exercises, but as legitimate and valuable artistic expressions. At the center of the exhibit, a special panel displayed a set of drawings created in collaboration. On one side, the works of the girl from the center. On the other, the visual responses of the millionaire's son. Together, they formed a fascinating visual dialogue that attracted the attention of experts and laypeople alike. The millionaire remained discreetly in the back of the hall, observing the public's interaction with the works. He wasn't there as a sponsor or central figure, but as a respectful observer of the work that others had created. His son, on the other hand, walked proudly among the guests, explaining in carefully chosen words the meanings behind the patterns and colors of his drawings. "It's extraordinary," commented a renowned neurologist, approaching the millionaire. "The visible progression in your son's work demonstrates exactly the kind of cognitive and emotional development that we rarely see documented so clearly. This could revolutionize our understanding about alternative neurological connections." "The credit isn't mine," he replied sincerely. "It was a 12-year-old girl who achieved what specialists considered impossible." Speaking of her, the neurologist smiled, indicating the entrance of the auditorium with a discreet gesture. The director of the center had just arrived, accompanied by a small group of children, among them the girl. Due to the legal restrictions still in place, the visit had been carefully coordinated with the legal department and child protective services. Officially, she was participating only as one of the artists in the exhibition, under constant supervision. The millionaire's son's eyes lit up instantly. Curbing the impulse to run towards his friend, he followed the established protocol, approaching the director first and formally greeting the group. The girl didn't look directly at him, but a small smile lit up her face as her fingers lightly touched the texture of the exhibit panels. "The colors are singing here," she commented, her voice soft but audible in the respectful silence that had formed around her. "Yes," agreed the boy. "I kept all the songs you taught me." The interaction, although brief and seemingly simple, had the depth of an ocean for those who understood the significance of what was happening. Two children whose minds processed the world in distinct ways, finding a common language through art and the senses. The representatives from Child Protective Services, present to supervise the interaction, exchanged meaningful glances. The genuineness of the connection between the children was impossible to deny or interpret as the result of adult manipulation. The exhibition proceeded with a series of short lectures by experts in neuroscience, inclusive education, and art therapy. The millionaire remained an attentive listener, absorbing information and perspectives that only months ago he would have dismissed as irrelevant to his world of acquisitions and corporate mergers. Near the official closing, the director of the center took the stage for a brief speech about the transformative power of art for neurodivergent minds. As she concluded, she made an unexpected announcement. "I would like to invite the founder of the Clara Foundation to the stage for a few words." A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Many expected to see the millionaire step forward, but to general surprise, it was his son who climbed the steps with cautious but determined strides. The boy positioned himself before the microphone, took a deep breath, visibly nervous but resolute. His voice, still marked by a certain characteristic monotony, resonated clearly through the loudspeakers. "My name doesn't matter. I'm just a boy who got lost inside himself and was found by someone who understood that lonely place." He paused, his eyes briefly meeting the girls in the audience. "The foundation is named after my aunt, whom no one let me know. She was like me and my friend. People who see colors in music and hear patterns that others can't." The simplicity and depth of his words created a reverent silence in the auditorium. "My father taught me about business and appearances. My friend taught me about true connections." He looked at his father in the audience with a small smile. Now he's learning too. After a brief hesitation, he concluded, "The foundation isn't about charity. It's about respect. We don't want you to fix us. We want you to see that different kinds of minds can create wonderful things together. The ovation that followed was spontaneous and emotional. The millionaire, with tears in his eyes, remained still in his place, not out of emotional detachment as in the past, but because he understood that this moment belonged entirely to his son. Later, as the guests circulated appreciating the works and talking with the young artists, a representative from Child Protective Services approached the millionaire discreetly. "I've been personally following this case from the beginning," she commented, observing the respectful interaction between the children a few feet away. "I confess that I started the investigation with serious reservations about your intentions." The millionaire nodded without defensiveness. "They were understandable reservations, considering my previous behavior. What I've witnessed today," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "is something we rarely see in our investigations, a genuine transformation, not only in the external circumstances, but in the people involved." With a meaningful look towards the children, she added, "I'll recommend the closure of the investigation next week. The contact restrictions will be reviewed, considering the educational and therapeutic context of the foundation." The relief that the millionaire felt wasn't for the restoration of his reputation or freedom of action, but for the possibility of his son recovering the connection that had brought light back into his life. "Thank you," he replied simply. The representative smiled slightly. "Don't thank me. It was your son who convinced us today. He has a rare eloquence, not in his words, but in his authenticity." As the evening progressed and the event drew to a close, the director of the center approached with the girl. For the first time in weeks, they could talk directly, even if briefly. "You've created something extraordinary here," commented the director, indicating the exhibition around them. "It wasn't me," replied the millionaire. "It was her." He looked at the girl with profound respect. "You saved my son when all the experts failed, and in the process, you may have saved me too." The girl, who was tracing invisible patterns in the air with her fingers, replied without looking directly at him. "Some people need to break completely to find the parts that were forgotten." The profound simplicity of her observation struck the millionaire like a revelation. It was exactly what had happened. His carefully constructed life had needed to crumble so that he could finally rediscover the parts of his humanity that he had sacrificed on the altar of success and control. His son approached, holding his latest drawing, an abstract but recognizable representation of two children and an adult, connected by colored lines that formed the outline of a bird in full flight. "For you," he said, extending the paper to the girl, "to remember that the colors keep singing even when we're apart." She accepted the gift with a small smile, her fingers delicately tracing the lines of the drawing. "The bird found its way out of the box," she commented, a reference to the glass sculpture of Aunt Clara that had catalyzed the transformation weeks before. The millionaire, observing the interaction, understood that he was witnessing something that all his money and power could never buy, a genuine connection between two souls that society often labeled as different or broken, but who in reality possessed a wisdom and perception that he was only beginning to glimpse. 6 months had passed since the inauguration of the Clara Foundation. The old boardroom on the top floor of the corporate building had been transformed into an art studio flooded with natural light. The mahogany tables and leather chairs were replaced by colorful workstations adapted for children with different sensory and motor needs. The millionaire, dressed with a simplicity that would have been unthinkable a year before, was guiding a small group of corporate volunteers, executives from his own company who dedicated a few hours a week to learn about neurodiversity through art and direct interaction. "Remember," he explained while preparing materials for the afternoon session, "we're not here to teach or fix. We're here to learn a different form of communication." "Sir," called his assistant from the studio. "Door, they've arrived." The day's visitors weren't investors or business partners, but a group of children from the center, including the girl whose inadvertent intervention had transformed so many lives. After the closure of the Child Protective Services investigation, a formal art therapy program had been established in partnership with neurologists and specialized educators. The millionaire's son, who now attended an inclusive school where his peculiar abilities were valued instead of suppressed, stepped forward to greet the group. His movements still carried a certain stiffness. His speech maintained some peculiarities, but the transformation in his confidence and ability to connect was evident to anyone who had known him before. "I've prepared a new project today," he announced to the visitors, leading them to a large central table covered with diverse materials. "We're going to create art that can be felt, not just seen." The girl, now a regular visitor and respected collaborator of the program, explored the space with comfortable familiarity. Her fingers danced lightly over the different textures available on the table as she processed the sensory possibilities of each material. The millionaire observed the scene with a feeling that still surprised him in its intensity, a mixture of gratitude, humility, and hope that had replaced the defensive arrogance of his previous life. That morning, he had received the news that the business magazine that had once celebrated him as the ruthless emperor of business had selected the Clara Foundation as Social Initiative of the Year. The contrast between the man he had been and what he had become couldn't be clearer. "Allow me to show you something," said the director of the center, approaching with a folder. "I believe you'll appreciate it." Inside the folder were drawings made by various children from the center, not just by the girl who had become so important in their lives. Each drawing represented their interpretation of the program and the experiences lived in the corporate studio. "This one," explained the director, indicating a particularly vibrant composition, "is from a 9-year-old boy who hadn't spoken a word before starting to participate in the program. Last week, he described to us each element of his drawing using complete sentences for the first time." The millionaire leafed through the works with reverence, recognizing in each one not only artistic expression, but deep communication from minds that process the world in unique ways. "You know," commented the director, observing the interaction between the children and the corporate volunteers, "when you showed up in my office that day, I never imagined we'd get here." "Neither did I," he admitted with a genuine smile. "I believe I severely underestimated the transformative power of authentic human connection." In the center of the studio, his son and the girl were working side by side on a large shared canvas. Without words, they had developed a system of communication through colors and shapes that allowed for the collaborative creation of impressive works. Their hands occasionally touched when reaching for the same material, a contact that before would have provoked discomfort, but that was now accepted naturally. "He asked me something interesting yesterday," commented the millionaire, watching his son. "He asked if I thought Aunt Clara would be proud of what we've built in her name." The director turned to him with genuine curiosity. "And what did you answer?" "I said I couldn't know for sure," he replied, the honesty evident in his voice, "but that I hoped I was finally living in a way that honored who she really was, not just the convenient memory I constructed to hide my guilt." That afternoon, while the children presented their creations to the corporate volunteers, the millionaire remained discreetly in the back of the room. He observed with silent satisfaction how executives who previously discussed only profit margins now knelt down to the children's level, listening attentively to explanations about textures and emotional meanings of the colors. His phone vibrated with a notification. The company's stock price had reached a new record high. A year ago, he would have interrupted any activity to celebrate such news. Today, he turned off the device and put it away without even commenting on the fact. Some victories, he had learned, are measured in hesitant smiles, in newly formed sentences, in connections established against all odds, not in percentage points or financial headlines. At the end of the session, while the visitors prepared to return to the center, his son and the girl completed their collaborative work. The result was surprising. An abstract but emotionally resonant composition that seemed to capture the very concept of transformation. "What do you think?" asked the boy to his father, a trace of vulnerability in his voice that before would have been carefully hidden. The millionaire observed the canvas for a long moment, truly absorbing the depth of what he saw. "I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed," he replied with absolute sincerity. The girl, still without establishing direct eye contact, commented in her characteristically direct manner, "It's about breaking and finding new shapes." "Yes," agreed the millionaire, understanding the philosophical depth of that seemingly simple observation. "Sometimes we need to break completely to discover who we really are." That night, after everyone had left, the millionaire remained in the empty studio. He approached the window that offered a panoramic view of the city that he once saw only as a chessboard for his corporate ambitions. On the nearby shelf, the glass bird that had belonged to his sister now occupied a prominent place, no longer locked in a box of painful memories, but exposed to the light, refracting it into hundreds of rainbows that danced across the walls. "You were right, Clara," he said in a low voice to his absent sister. "I needed to find someone who would teach me to see beyond appearances." His son entered silently, joining his father by the window. For a few minutes, they remained in comfortable silence, something unthinkable in the days when every interaction was governed by rigid expectations and superficial communication. "Dad," said the boy finally, his voice carrying an important question, "do you think we're broken?" The millionaire considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he replied after a moment of reflection. "I think we're like that glass bird. When the light passes through us at a certain angle, we create patterns that others can't see for themselves." The boy smiled, satisfied with the answer. "That's what the girl always says, that we're not broken, just tuned to different frequencies." "She's wiser than many adults I've met," observed the millionaire. "Including you?" asked the son with a trace of humor that would have been unimaginable months ago. The millionaire laughed, embracing his son's shoulders gently. "Especially me. I spent decades building an empire, but it was a 12-year-old girl who taught me the most valuable thing of all." "What?" "That true strength isn't in controlling the world around you, but in having the courage to allow it to transform you." If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive new stories every day. Have you ever met someone who completely changed the way you see the world? Comment below and share this story with someone special.